Welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert in Washington, D.C. with your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz. Talking two kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now, your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Hello and welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert. It is Wednesday, July 21st. I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and this is our weekly dive into living as two kingdom citizens in the world today for the sake of the culture and the mission of the church. And you know, this time is not only challenging to the church's witness in the world, this is a time when the forces of culture and the forces of rebellion in the spiritual realm itself are aligning, I think, to silence the voice of the church. And that's really not an opinion, it's just a fact. I mean, we see this in litigation, we see this in policy and politics, and, we'll see how long we can keep constitutional protections in place. But again, we're not going to shrink from our duty. In fact, I think it's part of our duty to be a civilizing force in culture as well as proclaiming the good news of the gospel. That civilizing force is also a part of the Christian's work in culture. And, it may be pre-evangelistic, but it's also part of God's work in the world to preserve the world itself, as well as to call individuals to repentance and to save them. So, I keep hearing a lot from pastors who say, this work in the culture and in the politics is not the church's work. I just kind of counter that by saying, well, listen, if God gave us First Amendment protections and responsibilities, then Christians should put that to work. We should be thankful and use them. And there is a lot of suffering out there already right now that is unjust. And we have the ability to eliminate or alleviate that. And it's our duty to serve the people of God with such a commitment. I mean, I got a chance to see Jack Phillips this last weekend, Baronel Stutzman, and, to see what they're going through when our First Amendment protections, first of all, these are kind, gentle, loving people to even people with whom they disagree. And if you don't know that, then you're misinformed. And yet the state has decided to destroy them. And so, again, for us to be able to push back and say the state doesn't have that right, that's the case. And I think we need to use those rights that God has given us right now to protect especially innocent people from the kind of suffering that's just ridiculous. And then, again, such preserving work. I mean, what are we talking about here, folks? We're basically talking about the fact that we're advocating for God's moral, ordering voice in the world. And, we tend to engage this stuff as a church only when fundamental moral issues are vacated in the culture or are being used coercively against us in the church. And so, again, I don't understand why people would actually think that the issue is whether the church is being too political. We're trying to be as apolitical as possible until fundamental moral issues are violated in a sense that is destructive to the whole society. If you just let that kind of stuff be, if you just let this happen, you're actually, I want to tell you this, you're compromising our gospel testimony too. Because forgiveness for no sin, because there are no moral standards with which the society and the individuals have to comply, that becomes a gospel of God loves me just as I am, whatever I decide myself to be. And that's no gospel at all. So now just be clear about this too. Whatever we talk about here on the Liberty Alert, we know this is merely putting politics back in its proper place. And all we're trying to do is keep the church's message, which is God's no and God's yes on God's terms. We're trying to make sure that that is free to be preached so that everybody can hear for themselves. Now, If we fail at this, or if somehow the forces of culture overwhelm us, I'm under no illusion that we will stop sharing the whole counsel of God, or that people's determination to share the gospel without fear will be removed. But again, if we have the gifts of God to actually keep things free, I don't know why we would use them. So if we don't use the gifts that God has given us, even in his left-hand preserving work, we're just letting good people suffer unnecessarily in a country that prides itself on religious liberty as the foundation properly for all other liberties as well. So today, we're going to talk about, is a Christian to fight for, even defend civility, even as we also share and serve other people with the good news of the gospel. And if you've listened to this program long enough, you know that we think you can do it's a both and thing, not an either or thing. And that's the problem for a lot of Christians today. They've been browbeaten into this either or discussion, and that discussion is wrong. It mischaracterizes what God is doing in the world to preserve and to save. So Christians do need to learn the difference between fighting for and contending for civility, which... And then the government's supposed to be about that. Politics is supposed to be about that. Vocation, faithful husbands and wives and fathers and mothers supposed to be about that. It doesn't save us, but it's a ground floor of civility that needs to be put in place, or all hell can break loose in a culture. But we know that's still, that's the penultimate work. The ultimate work is God bringing people to repentance and to saving faith. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the unwillingness of church people to do this. And if you're unwilling to do this, you basically are participating in the culture's decay, and it complicates our mission. We'll talk about that. And the unwillingness to engage this civilizing of culture does lead to unnecessary suffering, and it's happening even now in our country too. Finally, listen, God engages the world two different ways, to preserve and to save. So if God can do it, if God's engaging that way, we can too. So thanks so much for your prayerful support. Gosh, I don't even know how to say thank you, because, when the pandemic hit, we thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be a really rough year for the LCRL. And it actually was a good year for us. Not a great year, but a good year for us. And it's because of the dedication of those of you who listen in, those of you who support us. So if you want to continue to support us, and believe me, this program is actually supported by the LCRL, but the LCRL is you, because it's your sponsorship, it's your donations that make us who we are. So you can go to lcrlfreedom.org, lcrlfreedom.org, and there's a button there where you can donate to our work. And if you want to not only keep our work in D.C., but expand our work in D.C., that's one of the great ways to do it. And then secondly, put our resources to work. We got all kinds of resources for you. And we're going to be partnering even more closely with Alliance Defending Freedom to give you legal resources that will help your churches, your schools, and your preschools. So if you join us, we promise to bring you the kind of resources that will bless you. Now, this week, before we get into our topic for the day, there are several things that are happening that give us a glimpse of what we're facing to try to be our voice, our biblical voice in D.C. and also in this culture. And I just want to step back for a second. Look, I've been at this for 4 years now. I've engaged in discussions with people who agree with us, disagree with us, and others who wish to wipe us out. And our view has always been to try to reason with those with whom we disagree, to uphold constitutional protections for everybody, even those with whom we're disagreeing. We need those protections to have a civil society, so that when we do disagree, at least we know why, and we can try to live civilly with those with whom we disagree, without having to use the overbearing coercive power of the government to squash those with whom we disagree. That's been our perspective. That is our perspective even to this day. Unfortunately, the ideological opponents that we're dealing with today in Washington don't play by those rules. Let me just say it again. They don't. In fact, I think they use those rules oftentimes against us. So again, I'm not talking about classical liberals and classical conservatives who, with constitutional fundamental principles in common, engage in a dialogue. I'm talking about what I call secular pietists, secular progressives, secular Puritans, who now have determined that even democracy itself, freedom of speech itself, we need to get rid of those things, and we sure need to get rid of the church's opposition to our particular policies. And that's who we're dealing with today in the kind of public realm. And they don't play by the rules of civility anymore. As you watch the violence of the last year, as you've watched people literally just being browbeaten into submission in many different ways. And that's what I said, when you look at Jack Phillips and see what's happening to him, Baronel Stutzman, what's happening to her, what's happened to churches that have tried to just be fair and honest about a lot of the issues of the day, you're seeing not just a dialogue or an agree to disagree, live and let live kind of response. You're saying, no, you cannot have that view. Now, when I was studying, finishing my PhD in Black liberation theology and its challenge to Christian ministry in the city, there was a phrase that came out a lot. There was a principle that came out. It's called delegitimation. And when you look at liberation theology, and now, of course, critical race theory is kind of an extension of that, it's basically a Marxist thing that instead of using the bourgeois versus the proletariat, you're now using racial categories to create the notion of oppressed and oppressors. And so the whole goal is to delegitimate, to actually humiliate and destroy opposing points of view. It's a zero-sum game to kind of these quasi-Marxists, whether they're racial Marxists, whether they're economic Marxists or whatever. And the church, for whatever reason, if we give in to this stuff, well, we might as well, the law and the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ will be basically unheard, or it'll be retranslated to almost mean nothing in the generation that comes. But this concept of delegitimation, it's a humiliation concept. It's a zero-sum game. Politics is the only game in town, and politics is about winning and silencing the opponent. So one of the ways they do this, they pick a target, they freeze it, they personalize it, and they polarize it, and they humiliate it. That's the whole point. It's not a dialogue. So when people tell me bipartisanship, yeah, I would love bipartisanship. Let's dialogue. Let's talk about core principles. Let's talk about what it means to actually serve the poor or to actually make freedom possible for the greatest number of people. Let's talk about that. That's not how they approach these issues. And so as we kind of deal with this, we begin to see how destructive it can be. And one thing I've also learned is when you finally use reason and statistics and data and all this kind of stuff to respond to their baseless criticisms or baseless caricatures, if you actually expose them to what they are, then they do this last thing, which is even more amazing. They project onto you or onto their opponents what they're actually doing. It's amazing. So if you ever catch them with their hands in the cookie jar and you actually demonstrate that what they've been doing all along is misinformation or destructive, then they just say, oh, everybody does it, including you. And that's how they move on. I saw this happen a lot. Even in my studies, when you think about things like Victorian ethics, why do we have such a prudish view of Victorian ethics? It literally saved its society from the destructive powers of libertinism. There were times when children were being prostituted out to the powerful, and they were being dispensed with as if they were human garbage. And Victorian ethics came and said to the powerful and to those who weren't powerful, here's the way to live civilly so that we can all be protected as humans. Why is that not a good thing? Why do we create that as being prudish? Well, it's because it said no to certain things. We see that even how we look back on the 50s in our culture. We have movies all over the place that talk about how the 50s was a repressive age and all this kind of nonsense. But anyway, more to something that's going on today. The defund the police. We engaged that issue, by the way. We were right up front with that. In fact, let's go even further back. When we dealt with the Colin Kaepernick kneeling thing, we said the principle is you don't do politics during the business day. You don't do politics on company time. You do it on your personal time. I mean, that's the principle. And where do we get that principle? Well, when Jerry Jones wanted to put a patch on the Dallas Cowboys uniforms that honored the police. Now, who are the police? The police who defended Black Lives Matter's march. They defended their ability to march, and they were murdered for it. Okay? They were murdered for it. And so Jerry Jones wanted to honor those police who had been killed by a gunman, a sniper. And he was told, no, you cannot politicize the NFL. Do not politicize us. That's something people can talk about in their own personal time outside of work. And there's a lot of businesses today who are saying, yeah, well, the last thing we want is people going after each other politically. Now, I always find it kind of funny that when you start to actually really investigate this stuff, you never see a business where it's 99% conservative, but you see all kinds of businesses. You see school systems, whole school systems where 99% of the people are secular progressives, or you see whole law firms, or you see whole political machines, or whole cities who are one party. And yet that's not a problem. That's not a problem. Where's the bipartisanship there? But anyway, so again, this delegitimation. So our policy was, well, if there's no politicization of the workplace, well, then even kneeling for the anthem is to be done outside of company time. That's it. Then even to the defund the police thing, we're saying, we actually took the position, look, we don't want like an occupying force in our neighborhoods any more than anybody else. And so if you defund or you limit government in your neighborhood, then you've got to empower the traditional family, because fathers are the only people, good fathers are the only people who can stop the violence that comes when 15 to 19-year-olds are high on testosterone, as I often say. They're the only ones who say this far and no farther without the police saying this far and no farther. So we argued, okay, if you're going to defund the police, if you're going to limit government in your neighborhood, and limited government is kind of a conservative principle, but limited government means you've got to have self-disciplined family units that actually do what's right on their own terms without the coercion of government. Well, Black Lives Matter, the BLM movement, wanted to defund the police and destroy the family. That just leads to chaos. So again, we're happy to get involved in these discussions. We're happy to talk about what really works for people who need things to work. And by the way, we found out that the black community, the Hispanic community, the urban community, the white community, they want good policing because they know that there are bad folks out there. And people just want to raise their families in peace. The Cuban uprising also showed again where, by the way, so they defund the police movement. So now there's certain people finding out that statement isn't playing well politically. And now they're starting to blame those of us who are against that movement. They're blaming us as if we are the ones who wanted to defund and destroy the police in the cities around the country. Do you see what they do? They try to delegitimate you, and when they're caught with their hands in the cookie jar, then they project onto you what they in fact are doing. The Cuban uprising is another good example. These are the only illegal immigrants that they don't want in the country at this moment in time. Why? Because they're coming here for freedom. They're coming here saying communism is brutal. They're coming here and saying that when the government owns your property, when the government owns all the properties, when the government actually determines whether you have an identity or not, it's a hellacious thing for people, because people were meant to be free. Now, not free to do whatever they want, but free to do what is right, free to do what is faithful, free to do what God wants for us to do in His name for the sake of others. So, and again, even the Jim Crow voting laws, I don't even want to get into this. It's so ridiculous because when you see, they got their hands caught in the cookie jar because the Georgia laws are actually more expansive, allow more people or more opportunities to vote. They just only want citizens to vote. And the bigotry of low expectations is part of the opposition, claiming that people can't get their own IDs. And they're calling it the Jim Crow of the 21st century. And I'm laughing a little bit because I'm thinking, this is the party of Jim Crow. This is the party that did all these things. And now they're actually accusing, any honest attempt to limit the election to the people of America, and then to expand opportunities for all Americans to vote within their state, and then to find out that there are secular progressive states who actually have much more stringent voting laws, but that's not a problem. I mean, it's again, just remember who's caricaturing you. And remember, the goal is not to actually have a dialogue for some of these folks. The goal is to humiliate, to obfuscate, and to make fun so that you are delegitimated in the public dialogue. Well, we're not going to let that happen because truth is what finally wins out in the end. And we do want a dialogue, and we want to come to some level of civility with even with people with whom we disagree. That's our way of thinking about this stuff. And so, there are nuances to some of these issues, and that's why things like critical race theory, where they just say, no, there's the oppressed and the oppressors. There's just the blacks and the whites. There's just so if you had 3,500 folks back in the day when lynching was happening in America, you had 3,500 or thereabouts African Americans lynched. What about the 15 or 1,600 white people who were lynched trying to defend black folks from what I would call bigoted, racist Democrats of that time? What about them? Are they part of the power structure? No. What about the 550,000 people who gave their lives? So, because all the political ways of trying to eliminate slavery. And by the way, slavery was a universal thing. If you want to go as far back as you want, slavery was something that every other culture said, well, we just take it for granted. It's the way things are. Well, it was the West. It was first Britain and then America that said, in the colonies, no more of this stuff. In America, it took a while for us to root it out, but our own particular principles would not allow us to maintain this thing any longer. And that's where it came to a civil war. 550,000 people gave their lives in the middle of that war. So are you telling me that all those people were just either oppressed or oppressors? No way. There's got to be a way to dialogue these things. And destroying these statues is just destroying... It actually is destroying the history of the Democratic Party. And again, I don't want to be partisan here, but when you get to a certain degree and you start to say there's only one view on this, no, there's lots of different things going on in these issues. And there were people of goodwill who are fighting for the right thing all along. Let's not brand them as either or. Let's really look honestly into these things. And let's talk about real solutions that bless people. And the last thing you want to do is to actually give the government the power to actually make the call for all of us. So politics is a power game. That's why we think it should be limited. They shouldn't be deciding ultimately what's good, and they sure shouldn't be deciding what's conscience issues and the like. And so, when we start to see this, when I start seeing politicians talk about we're the Matthew 25 caucus, we're the ones who take care of the poor. I'm like, what? Oftentimes conservative Christians get accused of politicizing the church. Now, conservatives get involved in some moral issues and say these things shouldn't be happening. But that's not the main message of the church. We've never claimed that. But there are people today saying that they're claiming the benevolencing work of God in their politics. They're claiming to be the Matthew 25 caucus. Well, the Bible never commands the government to do Matthew 25. It commands believers, or at least free people, to freely serve. And so for people who are part of the government, which is a coercive, not a benevolencing body, for people who will coerce money out of one group of people so to give it to another group of people so as to keep themselves in power over all people, that's the exact opposite of Matthew 25. So again, some of this stuff happened just this week. This shows you what we're up against when they're willing to do this kind of delegitimation thing, but when you finally catch them in the act, then they project everything they've done onto you, and then you got to defend yourself from that projection. It's a crazy world in which we live. But the goal is to keep fighting for these fundamental truths because these constitutional protections are good for everybody. Religious liberty is good for everybody. The sanctity of life is foundational to what it means to be a civil society. The institution of marriage, if we strengthen that, then we need less police, we need less government, so let's do it. But it's the marriage between a man and a woman and their child, the trinity of civility that we talk about. It doesn't denigrate other relationships, but it just differentiates them. They are different. And then finally, educational freedom. We have the right to instill our values in our children. And no school board, no teachers, no government officials have the right to do that without the assent of the parents. Parental authority is going to be a huge issue in the days to come. Now, today, real quickly, then, we're talking about, is it Christian to fight for, even to defend the civility in our culture, even as we try to share it and serve people with the gospel? And the reason why this is a hard question to answer is because it's kind of a yes and no question. It depends on what issue you're talking about. So, a similar question would be, can a Christian be a soldier? Well, of course. They just need to be a faithful soldier to what a soldier is called to be, or a police officer, or a government official. In general, we typically answer these things by citizenship things with basic moral teachings of the Bible, or, vocational answers. Be a good father, be a good mother, be a good husband, be a good wife, be a good neighbor, those kinds of things. The church should be relatively apolitical. Because politics isn't going to save us. The message of the church is what saves us. But there are a few moral issues that rise to the point of challenging the church's legitimacy or the church's role in being a public voice in the culture. And if the church doesn't actually push back at that point, it risks being silenced, and then nobody hears anything about what God wishes for them to hear, both for their civilization or for their salvation. So, we are not of the world, but we are here for the world. So again, this preserving act, we differentiate God's saving work in Jesus Christ alone from his preserving work, which is merely an application of the Ten Commandments in their in their broadest sense, okay, in their broadest sense. So again, like if it says, honor your father and your mother that it may be well with you, you may live long on the earth. In the broadest sense, it just means that we're talking about parental authority, right? Parental authority is key, and it's ultimate over one's children. The state is a derived authority. The state does not have the permission to overstep the role of parents in the life of their children, especially when it comes to virtue and to instilling values in their life. That would be the broadest sense. So any law that actually destroys parental authority would be bad law, and it's going to be destructive to society. So again, this is a preserving work of God, and we're supposed to be a part of that. And generally, that's just to act out your vocations faithfully. So ask the right questions. It's not a what would Jesus do question. It's a what would the Father do to preserve the world, to discipline the world, to make sure that the world doesn't go over the edge and let all hell break loose in what's going on. It's also to have the right expectations of what the law can do. Law cannot save us. It can curb our worst behavior. If people drive the speed limit, like I say all the time, if they drive the speed limit, even when their heart's not in it, it still can be a good thing for society. Obviously, that's not a saving work, that's a curbing work, because if everybody drove whatever the heck they wanted to, whenever they wanted to, you would have all hell break loose on the streets of America, and then no one would get anywhere fast. When I was in California, when they had one of those power outages because of their incredible, foolish policies with electricity, but that's another show. But anyway, once the lights went dark, you want to talk about never getting anywhere fast with your car. And that just shows how law and order, even if it doesn't save us, can keep us from becoming the worst we can be. And then, of course, if we're seeking ultimate solutions here, it's about changed hearts. We're not looking for government. We're not looking for coercion. That's a limited role in our life, but a necessary one. But the best way to change is to have hearts changed, to have neighborhoods changed because of people who really care and love one another the way God in Christ loves us. So do that faithfully and see what happens. So Christians, we need to learn that there's some things we need to fight for the sake of everybody. That's the civilizing things, contending for civility, even as we maintain our ultimate work of sharing God's law and gospel for the sake of trying to bring people to faith. Now, a couple of things real quickly, though, an unwillingness to engage the culture. So it's one thing to say whether it's right. It's kind of a yes, it's a both and kind of yes, to fight and to serve. But there are people who are unwilling to engage the culture for the culture's sake, And I'm just telling you, if you do that, then you leave this in the hands of others, and without the kind of moral limitations that God puts into our hearts and also into the Word, so that we can see the positiveness of His limiting law in our lives. It actually can cause all kinds of cultural decay. We're seeing that all over the place. The destruction of the family, the libertinism of sexuality, the perversions that we now actually call good things. We're actually destroying our capacity to be human beings, let alone saved human beings. It's hard to, and then for those of you who say, well, yeah, but our job is to share the gospel. Man, it's hard to share the gospel when all hell is breaking loose in society. It's hard to share the gospel, too, if the culture's been led to believe there is no right and wrong, or there is no virtue, there's no limitation to our choice for ourselves. So, when we talk about this, we do want a dialogue. We want to maintain the freedoms of people who disagree with each other to actually have to dialogue with each other, not to use the coercive power of the state to shut one another down. But again, when we look at this, we're now dealing not with what I would call classical liberalism or classical conservative constitutionalism, where we could agree to fundamental principles, but we might differ with how we want to deliver those things into people's lives. Now we're dealing with a whole new view of humanity, a whole new view of the purpose of government, and that is, these are, I would call them the cult of self-centeredness, secular Puritans. If you want to see the witch trials from a secular point of view, you're going to start to see secular blasphemy laws in the West, and that's coming even to America too, because you reduce everything to personal choice. And now you have to have 330 million laws because there's no one law that's good for all of us. Now, if you don't engage, that's the reality. But here's the worst part. If you don't engage, if you think this is something that Christians shouldn't be doing, this civilizing of culture, it's going to lead to unnecessary suffering of real people. I got a chance to talk to Jack Phillips personally this last week, and Baronel Stutzman, and when you start to see the suffering they're going through, and then you ask why, because they're really nice people. They're kind-hearted. They're the kind of people you would love to have living next door to you. They're just that kind of folks. Even if they disagreed with your view or your lifestyle or whatever, they're going to be good neighbors to you because both of them are. But the state determined, you know what? We're going to shut them down. Why? Because they actually have the audacity to believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's it. They believe in the institution of marriage, not merely the relationship of marriage. They don't think that they're not trying to impose that view of relationship on anybody else. They're just saying it's different. And it is. It's absolutely different. Male, female, child. It's the trinity of civility. There's no other union that has that capacity. And that's the only role the state should have in keeping that union together. They're making it hard to break it up because the state doesn't want to raise children. That's it. That's the only reason for the state getting involved in marriage. And these other relationships, whatever they are, that's your choice. But people should have the choice to say, well, I don't believe in that choice, or I disagree with that choice, but I love you and I care about you. I'm not going to affirm that because it's against my own conscience. And instead of just agree to disagree, live and let live, what we have is sue the heck out of them, destroy their lives. I don't care if she's a 77-year-old grandmother. I don't care if she's actually cared about people. Even the very people that she said no to actually don't want this to happen to her because she's been such a kind person to them all their lives. It doesn't matter. Destroy, destroy, destroy. Delegitimate. Remember that word because it's going to become a real important word in the days to come. So, and again, churches are often accused of actually not caring about the community. I don't have time to get into this today, but there's a church called The Crossing in Columbia. All they did was preach on Genesis 1:27 and ask some probing questions, and it was a question that, again, talked about God's ordering of the world, male and female, God's, the whole concept of marriage and why it's so important for society, all these things, and the person just asked some questions. Now, this is a church that was known to be out in the community. I think they forgave several $100,000 worth of loans. They raised money. They've been helping the poor. They've been doing all kinds of things. They've been supportive of the arts. They've been doing all these things in the community. But that one sermon got them into such hot water that the state literally turned on them. Columbia, Missouri. And if you remember Columbia, that's where that Supreme Court case with Trinity Lutheran happened, where they tried to actually destroy a church's capacity to receive a blessing that they deserved as much as anybody else. So again, even when churches are trying to do everything compassionately, authentically, it doesn't matter. The folks we're dealing with delegitimate, put them in the corner, silence. We got to push back on that. If you're a freedom-loving person, whether you're a left-wing person or right-wing person, you should be one who believes in that for all people. And you should be a person who defends conscience, because if we destroy that, I mean, what's the point of all this going forward? So I do believe, if you're a Christian, look, God engages the world to preserve it and to save it. If God engages the world those two different ways, they're different ways. One is ultimately through his law, and one is ultimately through his gospel, and he differentiates that work. Well, then why can't you do the same thing? Why just learn how to differentiate those two works and be useful in God's hands to others? I mean, God's no curbs society's worst intentions. And the last thing you want is a state to determine what God's intentions are, or a state to determine what humans are supposed to be about. That's where the church and moral people should stand up and say, the state, that's a state that's usurping its authority. God's no leads to that curbing, but it also leads to repentance, which finally turns people to see that there's good news, there's changed hearts, there's freedom possible, which is not freedom to live just the way I want to, but freedom to be faithful, freedom to live as God wants us to live. So if God can engage in the preserving aspect of the culture as well as proclaiming the saving aspect by grace alone through faith in Jesus alone, then believers can do the same thing too. So look, not every one of us is called to a real active role in this preserving work. I don't know if you're a lawyer, if you're a politician, if you're a policeman, if you're a school board member. I mean, that's part of your preserving work. Not everyone is called to that level of it. There's only a few instances where the whole church is called to respond, and we've talked about that. We call it the grid of engagement, and we teach it at our Champions for Liberty weekend. There are a few things the church has to say, thus saith the Lord, for the sake of Caesar. But there's not many, because remember, Caesar's role is to put a basement floor in, not the ceiling of life, the basement floor of life. So, again, how many do you need to be a Christian to fill a pothole? If you limit Caesar to fill in potholes, then just get a person who can fill the pothole. Well, our founding fathers limited Caesar. They limited government. They made it something that had answer to the governed, and then they set people free by their consciences to do what was right for each other. That's a pretty cool place to live in, and we need to at least cherish that for as long as we can cherish it. If finally it's removed, if finally the forces against it overwhelm it, we'll still preach and teach the whole counsel of God. But for now, we have it, so let's put it to work. So again, if God is the one who can engage the world two different ways, we can engage the world to preserve it and to save. We can learn when to fight and when to serve. So the last thing I just share with you is that in a lot of these things, folks, again, it's still vital to be out in the community as people. Be good neighbors in your neighborhoods. As church people, get to know the police, get to know the firefighters, get to know the mayor's office. Be the kind of people who don't just go there when you have an axe to grind, but go there as people who really do believe you have a responsibility, even if you disagree with the regime in place, to be prayerful with them, to be honoring to them, and to at least demonstrate that you look to them to do their limited work faithfully for all people. And if you do that kind of relationship building in the community, even when the craziness breaks out, you're going to find that even those in power might say, I really do want to talk to you because I know you've always had a heart for all people, not just for yourself. So again, when it's all said and done, yes, it's a Christian thing to do, to learn how to fight for the civilizing things in culture and how to serve the culture with the good news of the gospel. It's a both and thing, not either or. So thanks again for the emails. Keep sharing those things. Keep praying. But again, until we see him face to face, speak the truth in love with humility and grace, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Until next time, God richly bless you. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.